before, how then can they call on the one they've not believed in? How can they believe in the one whom they've not heard? How can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can they preach unless they are sent? Now, what I don't think you realize as you read this, and we read this hearing the missionary imperative, is that what this really is Paul is answering the first excuse that they've made. And their excuse is, we hadn't heard. We don't know about this new Christian stuff that you're telling us about. How have we have heard? And Paul answers, verse 15, how can they preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring the good news. And he quotes from Isaiah. In other words, Paul is saying, you can tell me all you want. No one's been sent. No one's been with the message, been to here to speak to you. But I want to tell you, your history is full of people with the good news of God who have been sent to you over and over and over. And the great Isaiah, the great prophet, recognized it and said how beautiful their feet are. They've been there. Their first excuse was, how can they hear without a preacher? And his answer, quoting from Isaiah, preachers have been sent. The second excuse, in verse 16, how can the message be valid? But not all the Israelites accepted the good news. Their answer, their excuse is, if this is true, this message of the good news is true, well, not all the chosen ones have accepted it. Just some have, and not all of them. That makes the message invalid. Paul's answer to them is, again quoting Isaiah. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our message? Consequently, faith comes from hearing the message, and the message is heard through the word of Christ. Paul is saying here, God always knew that many of his chosen people would not believe. God's not surprised. Just because some of them wouldn't hear the message does not invalidate the message. He knocks down excuse number 2. So then they give excuse number 3. They must not have heard. We jump to verse 18. But I ask, did they not hear? Paul's answer, of course they did. And then he quotes Psalm 18. Their voice has gone out into all the earth. Their word to the ends of the world. Have they heard? Yes, they've heard. God sent the message everywhere. Earlier in Romans, Paul talks about how the message is both external and it is internal. It's in all of creation and it's inside of us in a moral consciousness that we all have, so that they are without excuse. They must not have all heard. Yes, they heard. Then they give excuse number 4 in verse 19. Again I ask, did Israel not understand? They didn't get it. Don't you see, Paul? They didn't get it. And his answer is, I will make you envious by those who are not a nation. I will make you angry by a nation that has no understanding. Paul says this was God's plan. There will be those of another people who will understand. And my own people will be jealous because of it. They're trying to make this excuse that they were chosen, and by being chosen, they have a special status, and that special status means they don't have to worry about any of this. After all, they're God's elect, God's chosen, and God's chosen don't have to worry about these things. Paul knocks down one excuse after another, saying they have heard, messengers have been sent, the message is valid, because when the word of Christ is heard, it brings forth faith. They didn't understand, but God knew they weren't going to understand, but other people understood. Other nations have heard and they hear the message. One by one, he knocks down their excuses. This is the thrust of what these verses through the end of chapter 11 are about. They're about knocking down the excuses of the elect.